Okay, well, now that we do have a quorum, we'll go ahead and get this meeting, the special meeting of Thursday, March 18th, 2021 called to order. Please join me for a flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call, please.
Mayor Eisenbeis,
Present.
Mr. Christensen.
Here.
Ms. Nelson. Here. Ms. Himshoot.
Here.
Mr. Knox is running a few minutes late this evening. Mr. Mosier and Ms. Duncan are absent.
Great, thank you. Is there any correspondence or agenda changes for this evening? Seeing none, persons to be heard for any item not on tonight's agenda, not to exceed 3 minutes.
Good evening, Richard Ween. Today, I attended the Sitka Community Health Council. That is a quarterly meeting which was established when the hospital, Sikka Community, was sold to be an intersection between both search and city entities. The meeting was actually quite a good meeting, and it was very informative. Search spoke about new services and expanded services, as well as indices on what they are managing as it relates to things like cervical cancer, breast cancer, hypertension, and so forth. Of interest is that they are expanding their interventional pain treatment, which should be something very good for Sitka. And they have a number of people who will be performing procedural things for the management of pain under the guidance of a specialist who is trained in pain management. Of further interest, and I want to, I'm certainly not speaking out of school, is that Search has an intensive outpatient therapy for alcohol and substance abuse. There are 12 spots. It was started 2 years ago. And though it is not generally publicized, I certainly would like to mention this to help promote this type of service for our community. It was a quite an interesting conversation that was had, and I wish that basically these things would be nice to be open for public to listen to, like they might do to the assembly meeting. The other meeting I attended was the meeting for the sale of the Sikka Community Hospital. It was, to be polite, sparsely attended. This is a very important issue for the city, and I think that engagement is important, not only on the part of the citizens to make their wishes known, but also on the part of the assembly to perform a greater due diligence as to what the actual choices, et cetera, will be. I have 10 seconds left, and I will use that to thank you for your kind attention.
Is there any other persons to be heard this evening? All right, seeing none, that brings us on to new business. Tonight, we are here to have a discussion direction decision of the fiscal year 22 draft administrator's budget with the focus on the enterprise funds and internal service funds. So tonight will be an overview PowerPoint presentation that we do have a paper copy of in front of us, as well as it displayed up on the screen and in our emails. So There is no, the administrator does not necessarily need anything from us tonight, but if we do have any direction or if we need to make any decisions on these, we are able to. And then at the end, there is the wrap up if we need to talk about anything else tonight, budget related. So with that, I will turn it over to the administrator and thank you.
Yep, thanks, Mayor. As you said, this is a kind of a rehash of some of the things we discussed a few meetings ago with our enterprise funds. We have the rate increases that were proposed at that last meeting, and they're incorporated here. And we'll just present that to you and see if there are any changes necessary. With that, Melissa.
And my goal tonight is to give everyone an opportunity to ask any questions. You have the budget that our conversation at the last meeting led to. And my goal tonight is really with the presentation is to let you know what that budget has in terms of implications on the future of each fund. But certainly, please, if you have any questions, we're going to be going fund by fund. So please just jump in at any time if there are any budget related questions that you have. So with that, we're going to start with the enterprise funds, which are our business type funds, including our utilities. With the electric fund, we put together the budget using a 2.5% rate increase in our assumptions, as well as some increases in personnel costs that we discussed at the last meeting. That was a slightly higher wage for our line crew and the addition of a contract manager position. And then we also have increases in capital appropriations. So with that, you can see these lines show where our working capital, and this is working capital as you calculate it, current assets minus current liabilities. When we present our internal financial statements, we tend to give you a more conservative, we add some more debt in there, so the number is more conservative. This is the strict kind of business school definition of working capital, but applied evenly so you can see what the impact is. You can see that from 2020 actuals audited financial statements, we're projecting an increase in working capital at the end of FY21. This is largely due to the bond refunding that we've already done. It resulted in a lower debt service requirement, so that freed up working capital for the fund. So that's going up not because we have a lot of revenue coming in and fewer expenses. It's really an outside impact. And you can see that with the capital appropriations we have this year, as well as the ones projected in FY22, if we execute exactly as budgeted in FY22, our working capital will be going down a bit. This also takes into account, right now we have extra funds appropriated for the Green Lake project, and those funds will be de-appropriated, for lack of a better word, once we get the USDA loan going.
So our debt service requirement was 125%. What is it now? Or am I using the wrong figure there?
Referring actually to our debt service reserve. And that's a different calculation. And it went from, it was a bit over 10 million to a bit below 7 million.
Thank you.
So here we have 5 years of budget trends. So the first grouping is 2018 through what's budgeted for 2022 in revenue. So you can see it's fairly flat. FY20 did go down. This was because we held the rates lower through June last year. We kept the winter rates in place. So we are projecting an increase for this year and then a modest increase for the following year. We then go to our operating expenses, operating and administrative expenses. So you can see those have been fairly level with FY20, a result of low staffing being quite low, and FY22 being a bit higher. We tend to come in under budget here, so I would anticipate that we would not actually see that increase there. For debt, keep in mind that the 18 through 20 are actuals and do not include the principal payments. So you can see for those years, we're just showing the interest payments, and as they're slightly decreasing year to year. And then FY21 to 22 are both budget numbers. And so they include the full outlay, including the principal. And due to the refunding, our debt service is decreasing for the fund. We just this last week got the good news that the advance refunding for some of our other bond issuances is going forward. There had been a state Supreme Court ruling that had put a pause on that. It was supposed to happen last October. So that's moving forward again. So none of that is budgeted in, but that should help, particularly the electric fund. It will impact our GO bonds as well as possibly some harbor bonds. And then you can see our capital expenditures, the last line. The 2018 was really when we used up the very last of the remaining bond proceeds from the electric or from the Blue Lake project. So from that point, our capital expenditures or appropriations from working capital have been decreasing. So in terms of kind of the long-term outlook and the health of the fund, one of the things that we look at is depreciation as a sort of goal for what we should be, cash we should be generating and investment in our infrastructure. So the green box is cash that the fund generates after debt service. So it's really operating revenues, expenses. And then you can see in the blue box in FY21, it's looking like our capital expenditures are going to use up all that cash plus a little bit of our working capital. And, you know, it's a very capital intensive fund, as you can see from the depreciation number. As we move into FY22 with our projections, you know, we're in the same situation, generating a bit less cash, but maintaining the capital investments. So are there any questions on any of the budget detail for the electric fund?
Am I correct? I know there were several enterprise funds, if not all of them, in which we're allocating some cash to look at the long-term plans. The electrical fund is one of those, correct?
Yes, it is.
And is it all of our enterprise funds this year that we're getting that kicked off, or is there just select?
We have for all of the rate paying funds, so all of our utilities, not all of them were appropriated this year. I believe for water and wastewater, we appropriated funding with the FY21 budget to update the master plans there. This year, we have plans included in electric and harbors.
Okay, thank you.
So how, when you do, oh, sorry, Valerie, I didn't see you. Go ahead.
I have a question as to what would happen if we decided not to raise the electrical rates by 2.5%. We have a former electrical director that wrote, I believe it was a letter to the editor, suggesting some things that might help My concern mainly is that I know that we have a lot of people's power being cut off because they can't make the payments. Although we aren't apprised of how many and how much on a very official basis. Would it be devastating to the electrical fund if we didn't approve the 2.5% increase? Thank you.
I would say that first, I know our staff is always looking at other alternatives. The 2.5% is really kind of a baseline. That would be, I would say, the level that we can't afford not to do. Of course, in an emergency, there's always things, we opted last year, the assembly opted to forego the seasonal increase for a period of time. The fund will survive, but what ultimately will happen is a rate increase in the future, and it will probably have to be a more significant rate increase in the future. So that's really the goal that we're trying to do, is avoid spiked increases, because those seem to hurt the community more.
If I can jump in, I asked Scott to come up here because we also noticed that letter to the editor. And Scott had done some research on it over the past few days, and if you want to jump in with your thoughts on that.
Sure, and I would say probably more than the last few days, we just took a little bit of time to look at it. Mr. Britton's concepts are good concepts. We need to be doing a lot of different things. However, there's really nothing that's free right out of the chute. He mentioned quite a bit about interruptible type powers. And I would group most of what he put as interruptible. When you look at, possibility of charging stations, when you look at agricultural opportunities for growing, those are all things that we don't necessarily want to give. That would make sense as interruptible rates, which is going to be charged at less than a full rate. But in order to do that, we need the infrastructure to be able to turn those same utilities off. And part of the opportunity we have as we develop interruptibles is we have to be able to turn them on and off to manage our grid. And right now we don't have that infrastructure. And so that infrastructure does what? Oh, it costs capital. And so we, in developing the long range plan, we need to do the rate studies. We need to do the master plan. We need to be looking ahead of time. So when we do it once, we do it correctly, and we deliver the product that's going to benefit Sitka for a long term. And so we've considered pretty much everything that Mr. Bruton put in his letter, but these aren't knee-jerk reaction kind of, let's implement it today. Let's take the process to plan it out, to invest, to do it right. And I think that's the big picture. I mean, I've got a little bit of a paper response on it. I don't know how much time you want me to take.
I think that's sufficient. And then, I want to echo what Scott said about Mr. Elder said about the rate study, is that, that's where we can really start to dial in. We talk about some of the heavy infrastructure needs on island power and some of the other areas where it's harder to get electricity to them. And if we figure out through that rate study how to more accurately capture true costs to keep that infrastructure up and running, then we can start to address other areas such as the stuff that was addressed in the letter.
Oh yeah, sorry, Kevin. And for anybody tonight, please just jump in. If you have questions, go for it.
So one of the other things that we've been told by past electric department directors is that really we don't have a lot of excess. If we look out long term, we don't have a lot of excess capacity to be selling necessarily. If we go too fast on the short and try to get a lot of our capacity out there, we're not going to be able to generate enough in the long term as well. And we're going to have to start looking at additional capacity to be able to sustain ourselves in a way. One of the things that I had another question about, and I'm in my head, I'm making an assumption. I just wanted to hear it from you as well. But when we're looking at FY '22, we see a really big jump in heating fuel cost. And my assumption was that part of that is because Green Lake has to go offline and we're going to have to use diesel to generate. Is that correct?
So one, we always plan for some use and for whether that's for emergencies. And the way that the diesel charges go, I believe we take the first 200,000 and we put that as part of our budget for the year, and we plan on eating that. And when I say that, if we have to dip into it, there's no fuel surcharge for that portion. After we use up that portion, then that's when we enact a fuel surcharge that would show up on the rates. And wow, your statement there starting off was absolutely spot on. And I'll pass this around here. Or I'll provide it to you via email. How about that?
That'd be great.
Then when we start looking at our generation, yes, we need to optimize it. Like Mr. Bruton said, totally agree with him. The question then becomes, how much do we start obligating? And at what point do we get out ahead of our skis and we plan on a crash, right? Because that's not what we need. In order to get to the point where we really go into optimization, we need essentially a smart grid and a smart grid control system where we can turn off and on non-critical loads that are billed differently. When you start looking at that, some of this is going to take investment by consumers that want the interruptible loads, whether that's for greenhouses, whether that's for small commercial, whatever it is. As time goes on, the propensity to interrupt those loads as we grow in utilization is going to become higher and higher. And so there kind of is a diminishing return. It's a gamble of an investment. Hopefully we can manage that well. Hopefully part of our study can show us where we can get to. Also setting that interruptible rate so it helps the laws of supply and demand kind of interfere and we can get closer to our threshold. If we produce a given amount of power over the course of the year, which is highly dependent, by the way, on our water supply, in a dry year, the available power is going to be significantly less. Right now, I mean, this is one of the wettest years on record, and we've spilled a lot of water, but we cannot bank on the future that all years will be like that. And so we have to be very cautious in how we approach that. So, yeah.
Can I take a moment to answer another part of Valerie's question? I'm sorry, Ms. Nelson, I'll get better with the first name thing, I promise. You had asked about disconnects, and it's unfortunate that we had to reenact those after the expiration of the emergency declaration. But we have noticed that some of the relief that was offered over this past year, whether it was the extension of the winter rates plus the utility subsidies, the disconnects that we've seen over these last two billing cycles are actually lower than the number of disconnects that we've done in regular years. So that's a little bit of a brighter side to the story, but we have seen a lesser number of disconnects.
Off. Yeah, sorry. I noticed that obviously we're not funding depreciation. And I'm wondering how you arrive at that number. I mean, how long do you give a piece of equipment or something to say, okay, we're depreciating it? Like if you, for instance, if you gave the dam a 20-year depreciation, that's, it's obviously going to last a lot longer than that.
Sure. And it depends on the type of infrastructure. We go anywhere, if it's, a small piece of IT equipment, we don't expect that to last very long. That might be 3 years. Whereas the dam or components, we'll say, of the plant will be anywhere from 30 to 60, depending on what it is. So
it is a variable number.
Yes.
And I guess how accurate do you think it really is? I mean, I know it's I don't want to say it's a guess, but it's estimate, let's say.
Well, it is absolutely an estimate. I think one example that I'll mention in the course of the presentation is the wastewater treatment plant. That one stopped depreciating, I think, about 2 years ago. So, in the scheme of things, that one's not too far off. But it really depends. It's a best guess.
Depreciation, and this, sometimes it can be used for accounting purposes, for tax purposes. There's different methods of it. We generally use straight line depreciation. It depends on, like Melissa said, what type of capital we're talking about. And we also use it as a measure of our health too. So yes, a little bit of it is a guess. And in a dream world, you would want the capital investment to match that target. But we're more interested in what the gap looks like.
I'm afraid Mr. Elder might have run away too soon. He must have seen I had a question. I just wanted to know more about the rate study that you talked about. Is that something that's done in-house? Do we pay somebody to do that? How often is it done? Or when does it happen? Is it done every year? I just want to make sure that we're keeping current and keeping our rates as favorable as possible for those who need the favorable rates.
Sure. So the rate study would be something we would contract out with somebody who does rate studies. And I think that the last couple of attempts at it were done in-house, and it's been substantially long enough that we're due for a rate study.
Is it reflected in this budget, that expense?
Yes.
Like, that's going to happen in
Yes.
this year?
Yep.
Okay, and then we
As-
would make adjustments according to the findings?
Sure. Well, yeah, you would have the opportunity. You would present them,
Okay.
and then, and we may look better in some areas than we thought. It's very much a where are we, and then we make choices.
Okay, and then I had a very small question. Your dues and publications went up by double. What are dues and publications?
We're involved in we're involved in several different groups that are part of the power industry, and frankly, that raise is reflecting that we've actually been deficit in the last several years. So because we've already been keeping up with our dues to these organizations that we rely on for a lot of different information and training, we simply raised the cost to match what we've been shelling out.
Right, okay, I just wanted to make sure, like,
Sure.
it's important to keep current, and I support it.
Absolutely.
Just- Thanks.
And before you go, the one other question I had, just from a micro standpoint, the insurance rate. Why are we seeing almost a $200,000 jump there?
I can take that one if you want, Scott.
And by the way, we'll know more here shortly. We will be spending next week with the insurance folks as they visit town. So
Yeah, as it's always the case, we seem to run into that.
Yeah, so this last year in FY 21, we really learned that the rates were increasing significantly. One of our providers did not want to solely insure Green Lake and the machinery there. So we actually had to get a second insurer in there. And I mean, really, it's the cost and the age. It's also, according to our insurers, just the earthquakes across Alaska are driving up insurance rates for these kinds of things. And there's not a lot of insurers for them. So, we're kind of stuck in there. It is something that will probably come to the assembly at some point in terms of how much property coverage do we want to maintain. But right now, this budget assumes status quo. All right, we'll move on to water then. So you can see the water fund There's really not significant changes to the expense side. We have very minimal capital budgeted for this year, no new loans, and a 2% rate increase. You can see that our working capital in that fund is fairly flat from 20 to 21, but is growing going into FY22. The primary reason this is intentional, and this fund is gearing up to start repaying the debt on the critical secondary water filtration system. So that will probably kick in 2023. So you can see from 18 to 19, we had a more significant revenue jump, and that was a bigger rate increase, knowing that we were going to have to complete the secondary water filtration project. And from there, just the inflationary increases that have passed the past couple years. You can see the expense here. Again, we're really looking at 2021 and 22 budgeted numbers. And, there at this point, the 2021 is looking to come slightly under budget. And then 2022 there. The debt, again, it's fairly level. We have the most of our debt is 1.5% low interest DEC loans. They are now tied to a metric that moves with inflation. So right now debt is still quite low, but that could increase in the future. But the model does rely pretty heavily on those low interest loans. So for the water fund, you can see that the cash we're generating, there's not as much of a gap in this fund as we saw in the electric fund. The cash we are generating is covering our capital investment. We had a higher investment in FY21, lower in FY22. It's good to look at more than 1 year, because often we do have up years and down years in capital appropriations. The other thing to note is that once the critical secondary water filtration project is complete, that will boost the depreciation number fairly significantly.
When you say here the cost of debt will increase when inflation increases, are you referring to a variable rate loan, or that we will have to pay more for debt in the future?
Well, so right now, the DEC loans, they used to be set at 1.5% no matter what rates were. They have changed that. So it's now tied to a metric, which I cannot remember off the top of my head what it is. But it does mean that if rates in general are on the rise, then it's very likely that the debt will go up. They will remain, the intention is that they remain low interest. They'll still be lower than your average, but we're not guaranteed that 1.5% anymore.
Thank you.
I have a comment in that in the past 10 years, the water has increased 176% from 1825 in 2010 to 5044 in 2020. And so are you saying that we're going to have these exponential increases in perpetuity, like in 10 more years? Is it going to go up another 176% because of all the things that are happening?
The models, we're through the worst of the rate increases. And the model going forward is showing increases closer to inflation. And of course, this is another fund where the long-term capital plan is being updated. So as that's updated and we have more information, the model will be updated. Were there any other questions on the budget for the water fund, the budget detail? Okay. Moving on to the wastewater fund. Again, we have a 2% rate increase and fairly status quo expenses. We're getting close to wrapping up, I believe, with the wastewater treatment plant. That has been the most significant project for this fund. And that debt service will also kick in. So we have working capital. We're projecting it going down from 20 to 21, and then adding a bit as we go into the end of FY22. So you can see the revenue again with this fund. We went through a series of higher rate increases. We're now at inflationary rate increases. And, you know, the fund is being set up so that it can pay for the debt service for the wastewater treatment plant rehabilitation project. You know, again, we've got our expenses. FY20 across the board was kind of, everyone tightened their belt for FY20. FY21 budget is, you know, on track to, again, fall under budget. And then, you know, we're seeing a slight increase from 21 to 22. Our debt is fairly steady. Again, that will go up. The debt service is likely to kick in FY23. So we'll definitely see a jump in debt as we go into fiscal 23. And as is common with the funds, you see our capital investment kind of jumping up and down. But again, this is showing the investment of working capital, not of outside loan funds. And as I mentioned before, the wastewater treatment plant is not shown in our depreciation number. So, you know, I would say that since that is such a significant piece of the infrastructure for the fund, that this number is artificially low. It is nice to see a fund where there is not such a big gap between the cash that is generating and the investment in working capital. But this inflation will be increasing in the near future. Are there any questions on the wastewater treatment plant detail?
I don't have a question, but I have a comment in that this one has gone up in 10 years, 114%. And, you know, for government employees, inflation is probably a great and good measure, but for the rank and file people that are talking to me, they're having a hard time keeping up with these inflationary increases because they aren't getting, like in the private sector, the government, you know, raises and whatnot. And it's just tough if you don't work for a private entity to know the pain that those people are feeling. Thank you.
Okay, and the solid waste fund I'm showing, I'm not showing the exact same charts on this one because this one is really, this is not a fund that at this point is capital intensive. This is one that's really driven by contractual increases as we contract out a great deal of the work. So we have a 4.5% rate increase. We had originally proposed 2 years of higher rate increases when we worked the model through together this year. We decided on doing the 4.5 for 3 years rather than the higher rate for 2 years. So that's what the assumptions are based on. This fund is definitely seeing an impact likely from the pandemic. You know, everyone is connected to sewer. You don't turn your sewer off, you know, because you have fewer businesses, but you do, or fewer customers, but you do generate less trash. We're definitely seeing businesses, you know, reducing the size of their bins, reducing the pickups. So while that does save us on the expense side, it does hurt us on the revenue side. So we are projecting, in this case, the shorter bar is actually a good thing because the fund is in the negative. So from 20 to 21, we're seeing an improvement. But the projections for revenue that I based off of FY20 are pretty conservative. So we have costs increasing, and this budget assumes a fairly, you know, that we don't have an immediate rebound. So we actually see our working capital dip down a bit more for fiscal 22. So again, hopefully the revenue projections are conservative. But I prefer a more conservative projection than a more optimistic one. We also have some unknowns around, John has mentioned the issues we're having with closed containers. None of that is budgeted in here. So if anything were to happen on that front, we would be coming forward and having another discussion about this. So this assumes operations status quo. So you can see for the budget, you know, I have a slight decrease budgeted for 21 or 22 from 21. And our expenses are really, the growth in expenses is really related to the contractual increases and assumptions around increases in shipping things off island. This fund has very little debt and very little capital.
I think, to me, this one, there's things that we should be looking at as a city that, you know, structurally we could be doing differently. What those exactly are, we don't know yet. It's one of those really capital intensive ones if we were to take it on. And, you know, having a contractual agreement that we are bound to do something with, you know, I think this is one of those examples of our rates and utilities aren't just driven by government, you know, our own infrastructure, our own staff or other things like that. This is one of those ones that private industry is driving this price. And this increase is one of the bigger ones that we end up seeing. The other ones we're seeing 2%. This one is 4.5%. And that's driven by private industry, not by government.
Do we, I mean, does the recycling help or hurt this one, really? That's, I've looked at the numbers and it's really hard to tell.
I don't think it hurts. My understanding is that it it doesn't hurt. I think certain items help more than others. Certainly, recycling of scrap material, that absolutely helps. As did taking on the scrapyard ourselves. Just looking at the cost, from 2018 when it was contracted out to now, the cost there has gone down. So again, this is the same snapshot I shared with you at the last meeting. So just a reminder of the overall impact of the rate increases on a utility bill and what they would look like from winter to summer seasonal, with the overall annual impact being $186. So next we move on to the Harbor Fund. This is the fund with the largest proposed rate increase, and that is the 5%. We're in the second year of 5% rate increases that the Port and Harbors Commission recommended. You can see on this chart that our working capital drops pretty significantly by the end of FY22. And this is really because we had originally estimated the Eliason electrical project to be about 3.1 million, of which half would have been covered by a state grant. We've been waiting for that state grant for years now, and it's my understanding is it's getting to the point where the project needs to take place. It's also, this is one where the cost has increased significantly. So we have appropriated, we have 1.6 million of working capital already appropriated, and we're adding on 3.5 million for this project. So that's the reason that our working capital is dropping so significantly, combined with the fact that our revenue is down in the fund. Our raw fish tax was pretty much halved, and we expect it to remain low for a few years to come. And our transient moorage was also hit pretty hard this year. So you can see that our Harbor Fund revenues, certainly from 2019 through 2020 have seen a pretty steep decline. That's really due to the pandemic and the raw fish taxes. We are assuming somewhat of a rebound in transient moorage for FY22, but not in the raw fish tax. Our expenses are pretty flat. Our debt has grown as we took on the bonding for Crescent Harbor. And we are considering refunding the bonds that we took out for A and B Harbor. Those are ones that we'll be looking at as part of the advanced refunding deal. And then you can see the capital investment from the fund's working capital increasing pretty significantly. And this is another one that we are doing a master plan for. I think Eliason Harbor Electrical Project is the perfect example of one of the projects that's coming in much higher than was anticipated in the plan that was done nearly a decade ago. So that will certainly weigh in to our model. This fund, we actually today, as I was putting this together, I realized that we really should have an appropriate or the depreciation included in the budget for Crescent. So we will be, with the next iteration of the budget, we will be adding that in. I believe it's about $350,000. Again, that's not an outlay. However, we are required to include that in there. So you can see that for FY21, we're actually projecting negative or dipping into our working capital. We're really not generating cash. And we are investing in capital, which is great. And, you know, the spread doesn't look too bad here, but the number is artificially low. And then for FY22, we hope that we will be generating some positive working capital, but that is very much outweighed by the significant capital investment for the fund. Are there any questions on the detail for the Harbor Fund?
The thing that the commission talks most about is the worry of how outdated the master plan is and the underestimating of the cost now because marine construction inflation rates have been so high. You know, it is really concerning when you start looking out, you know, if we're looking at 5% now, but then we revisit what it really costs to maintain the infrastructure, replace it, we may be looking at even more unless we come up with additional planning or mechanisms to, you know, lengthen the age of our systems or whatever it might be. It is also frustrating that we're having to take on so much with the replacement of the electrical system in Eliason, just because that was something the state should have done right in the first place, and they didn't really do it right. And then we're having to take on a really significant investment in trying to keep that system running. And it's an important system that people really rely on, that electrical grid there in that harbor, and it's failing. So that's, I mean, if we ever have any opportunities to lean on the state, you know, that's got to be one of those ones that we got to talk to them about, to making sure that that fund is funded in the next budget iteration. It's not going to look good, probably.
So again, this is the same chart we looked at last time, just looking at the impact to moorage of a 40-foot vessel. So we have 9624 as the annual increase. Next, we're going to go over our smaller enterprise funds that don't have rates. We didn't talk about these at the previous meeting, but they tend to have, there were fewer kind of year-to-year significant changes and you know, no assumptions around rates. So for the airport terminal fund, you know, this fund, its working capital has normally hovered between 500 and 600,000. We're anticipating a pretty steep decrease by the end of FY21. That's because we now have debt service we have to pay on the bond issuance for the airport terminal project. And we don't have the PFC revenue coming in. You know, that's been has seriously declined. We hope it'll start to pick up at the end of this year, but that's still not enough to get us anywhere near where we need to be. It's almost certain that we will have to dip into what we call our rate stabilization fund. So in prior years, when we've exceeded the bond covenant, we take that difference and kind of reserve it for a future that we did not think would come so soon, where we're not going to meet our bond covenant. We should have enough to meet our bond. We will have enough to meet our bond covenant for FY21. If we don't see a rebound for FY22, we'll have to really look at it, and it could be possible that a small subsidy would be required. But at this point, I don't anticipate that.
So I think that kind of answers my question then. If passengers do not start flying in and we don't have the projected income and that fund continues to be in the negative, how do we pay? Assuming our rate stabilization is zeroed out, like what is our next step at that point in order to pay our bond debt?
Our first step would be to open discussions with the bond bank, and see if we could have a waiver, if we could use, the fund has some working capital it can apply, and see if we could go another year due to special circumstances. Otherwise, it would be most likely a subsidy from the general fund.
Do we know if any of the American Recovery, the latest COVID monies are going to cover anything? Because we're not the only airport terminal that issues PFCs, and everybody's got to be hurting. And the $15 billion that they're shelling out to airlines and other contractors, this seems like it should fit.
Potentially, we're learning more every day. I think we sat through our first meeting actually this week to start to learn some of those details. I don't think we were as successful as we wanted to be with the last round of CARES funding, given that the airport belongs to the state and we own the building. So I don't have a firm answer on it, but logically speaking, other airports are in this same scenario, and that is something that has been discussed, but we haven't heard any specific details on whether or not that'll be available.
Thanks.
And I'm just looking for a quick explanation of operating revenue versus non-operating revenue, because the non-operating fluctuates quite a bit. So what's an example of that?
The non-operating in this fund, that includes the PFC revenue, as well as the revenue that we get from car rentals. The operating revenue is primarily terminal leases.
Thanks.
So you can see the revenue is kind of up and down. Expenses are pretty steady. That really is building maintenance, and which also includes keeping the terminal clean. Debt has certainly grown as we get have the funding or partial funding for the airport terminal project, and then capital beyond that airport terminal project is really, around kind of just emergency critical maintenance items.
And it is the top of the hour. Does the assembly want to break before we continue? Yeah. Okay, we'll take a 5-minute break. Thank you.
Talking too much.
I know. I wanted as well, but. I appreciate that. Then we'll be out of here. Back into this.
Okay, we'll jump back into the Marine Service Center. This fund, you can see the working capital stays pretty steady. It's up around 2 million, adding a bit each year, which is really how a fund should work, building up for eventual infrastructure repair and or replacement. I think the challenge with this fund is that we know the issues with the bulkhead wall repair, and the 2 million is nowhere near enough to be able to deal with that. So you can see on the revenue side, 2019, we had a drop in revenue. We had a vacancy. We had a tenant leave. I don't think they were gone the whole year. The challenge there with this fund is when we're fully tenanted, they cover the utility costs. When they're not, we can't just shut it off. And so the expense increases quite a bit. You can see that we're putting some money back into the fund with our capital repairs. And we have some budgeted that has not yet been spent. There's very little budgeted for this fiscal year. Any questions on the Marine Service Center? Moving on to the Gary Paxton Industrial Park Fund. This is one that we've been eating away at the working capital year after year. We're up around $600,000 at the end of FY20, and that goes down below 500,000 by the end of FY22. It's a 21% decrease. The revenue is fairly steady. It has increased since the dock went in. That is generating some revenue. However, the way we're dealing with that is we also have to essentially hire harbor fund personnel to administer that. And so expense has increased as well. There's very little debt here, and the capital spending has been pretty minor. I think I actually have the wrong chart here, but yeah, this is the Marine Service Center chart. So sorry about that. But in general, the revenue for this fund has been fairly steady, increasing a bit since the dock went in. Expenses steady as well. We did last year, we had to come back mid-year. The dock use resulted in higher than anticipated electricity charges. And most of the capital funding in this project comes from other sources, either the Wastewater Fund or the Sawmill Creek Contingency Fund. This year, the only capital project is looking at a geotech for an old landfill, a geotech survey for an old landfill that has brought up concerns that staff have brought up concerns about. So that is, I believe, $120,000, but it's not coming from the working capital of this fund. It's coming from the Sawmill Creek Contingency Fund. So any questions on this or any of the other enterprise funds? All right. So we'll move on to the IT fund. So with the internal service funds, the goals are really somewhat different. These funds exist to provide services to other municipal departments. We don't want them particularly growing their working capital unless there's a specific reason outlined. So for the IT fund, we'd been working from a negative cash balance. And so that's finally gotten positive. We're projecting an increase through the end of FY21. Part of that is due to some projects that were not accomplished FY21. And so what we've actually done in those cases is in FY22, for example, if someone had a printer budgeted for FY21, that didn't happen, that department would get a credit for FY22. So, we're seeing the working capital increase in FY21, but it's decreasing in FY22. The kind of biggest year-to-year change for the IT fund is we are budgeting for a more significant outsourcing of some areas still to be determined of IT. And I think it's become especially apparent this fiscal year with the pandemic. We don't have the kind of depth of IT. We just don't have enough people to get done what needs to be done for all of the departments and their varying needs.
Melissa?
Yep.
When you say we don't have enough people, is that because of the load due to the pandemic, or is that a standing issue? And is there a position that just isn't filled?
No, it's a standing issue. I think over the years, the needs of the city have grown. I think they grew exponentially over the last year, but I would say we were short-staffed before the pandemic, and it's kind of hit a critical point now.
And how many are in our IT?
3, 4. We have one person who's almost who's primarily dedicated to the police department.
Right. Okay, thank you.
With the changes that have happened due to the pandemic, how much of that have we been able to appropriate to CARES or the funding that we had kind of set aside there, or is that something we just kind of took on our own?
We used a good portion of it, or we used a good portion of our CARES money to cover what qualified under CARES. So some of the remote meeting infrastructure we put in was covered with CARES, but that was in our 1 point, whatever it was, city budget to address some of the IT stuff. But I'd also like to add with this one is things have become more and more IT intensive. We have servers, those need upgrades, they need maintenance. You have security requirements that become more and more strict. As we become vulnerable to more and more cyber attacks, and yes, it even happens here as well. So we have to have folks that stay on top of that. But those are the same folks that always also have to go fix your printer, or your laptop stops working, and they're starting to get stretched thin. So I'm not 100% certain how we're going to address the outsourcing piece of it yet, but there's some good opportunities for a sort of a centralized service desk where at least people can call in and put in tickets, and there's somebody there that can answer and take care of that background stuff like the security, and might be able to fix your email without having to grab one of our individuals who might need to go work on your printer to address some of the things that can be fixed remotely, or have somebody monitor some of those other security concerns for us.
And is any of the services that we have, is any of it contracted out? Do we even look at that? I know it's sometimes it's kind of a flat cost when you compare it to actually having somebody within the city, but is that something we've ever explored?
I think that is the goal to explore next year is really seeing, what piece, which again, it's to be determined. We need to make sure that we do it right. But trying to find that area that would make most sense to have someone outside take care of.
Yeah, because that security one that's a growing industry there.
Yeah.
And I would also strongly encourage if we're looking at outsourcing about a full-time equivalent, I'd rather keep that family in Sitka. I know you both share my concerns on that, but I just want to really reiterate and re-push that point that if it looks like we can hire someone internally and get the same value for our services, let's do that.
Yep, that'll definitely be something we consider. We would come forward. That would be a budget adjustment. So you can see, as I mentioned, revenue goes down in FY22. That's kind of because revenue is derived from payments from other departments. Various departments got credits, and part of that is also some potential grant funding for some of our police systems that we didn't think would come through, and we think it'll come through. So that's the lower revenue here is actually good news. So and then you can see the expense growing from 2021 to 2022. And again, that's, just built-in increases as well as adding in outside resources. So this fund has very little debt. It does have an internal loan for, I believe, the phone system and the police system that we mentioned. And that the one capital piece there, often IT equipment is budgeted out of the home fund. In this case, it was managed out of the IT fund. So any other questions on IT? Okay, moving on to the central garage fund. We have only 4 vehicles that are planned to be replaced in FY22, totaling $117,000. These are primarily vehicles that have, hit whatever the threshold is for the type of vehicle and are due for replacement. I believe the brush cutting attachment is an add-on. That is one that is a need for the recreation department, but it's just an add-on to an existing vehicle.
I was hoping to get some clarification about what happened last year as far as fixed asset acquisition. Did we buy a bunch of vehicles last year?
For FY21?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I believe we did have a higher number. We also had some expensive vehicles. One, we just came forward with a supplemental appropriation, the boom
bucket?
truck,
Yeah.
which was $375,000, which wasn't quite enough. So yes.
So it was a bubble year.
Yes, and it definitely, it kind of seems like there'll be, we'll have a bunch come due one year, kind of have a quieter year. It's not perfectly cyclical, but.
Okay, thanks.
So with this fund, and I didn't see Harry here, but one of the things that a lot of people in Sitka are wondering about as the technology advances, and it's not going to necessarily be appropriate for every department, but as we move forward with vehicle replacements, looking at changing our fleet and moving more and more towards electric vehicles. As we look at that, one of the concerns, though, that we've always heard is that we don't necessarily have the trained staff or services available here in Sitka to be able to manage electric vehicles all the time. Even though their management is, and their maintenance is far less than, a combustion engine. What are we doing to start moving towards that? Or what planning do we have going forward? And are we keeping track of as technology advances and what we can do to begin to move towards that? Because, from an environmental standpoint, it's very important to a lot of people, but also from a standpoint of using our own fuel that we generate here in Sitka seems like a logical thing for us to pursue.
I definitely hope that that's an idea the Climate Action Task Force could bring to us and have us help them with a study and provide some recommendations on how to get there. I know it's been a while since we've met in person, but I remember before the pandemic really picked up, I remember meeting with the school district about some of the vocational training programs they have there, and a desire to start to look down that path of maintenance on more electric vehicles and training those students. And yeah, there will have to be that next generation, and we'll make that shift there. And I think that's a great opportunity for the school to maybe provide that vocational training, and then the city could potentially partner with them to bring that experience in, and as we move through that transition.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that to a certain extent. As we were talking about earlier, a big part of my job is buying vehicles. And we'll see with ambulance is on the back, but one of the things that I've heard is, we buy Fords because that's what they know how to work with. And Ford this year has the Transit van coming out as electric, the F-150 coming out as electric. They've already got multiple plug-in hybrids. And Chevrolet has multiple electrics as well. And frankly, this saying that there's, well, we want a truck, is an argument that doesn't hold much water anymore. Won't very soon. Ranges are 300 to 400 miles, and like Kevin said, the maintenance on them is a fraction of what it is on an internal combustion engine. And the prices are, especially when you consider the fact that the fuel, running it with fuel is so much less and maintenance is so much less, they actually wind up being cheaper and saving us money. So not to mention that we're paying ourselves for the fuel. So I hope we don't have to have a situation where, we have to have an ordinance saying it's time, because it just makes sense. And the suspension systems are the same. It's only the drivetrain, and the drivetrain has, half a dozen moving parts versus literally thousands. So there really are less maintenance. So I hope we continue to look into that. I looked at tonight, the vehicles this year, and right this minute, they don't make sense necessarily, but I think as early as next year, that will not be true.
The funds coming into the central garage fund are, all, money coming in for fuel, for insurance, admin, all of that, that's under revenue. And then the other piece of that is what the various departments who have vehicles pay in for the future replacement. So that's funding that goes into the vehicle sinking fund. The vehicle sinking fund at the end of FY21 was 6.7 million. We're not doing a lot of vehicle purchases in FY22, so that goes up to 7.6 million as of the end of FY22. You can see the expenses are fairly flat, and the vehicle purchases, I guess this graph shows that it is actually pretty cyclical. We tend to have a year where there's more purchases followed by a year with less, so. And the sinking fund goes up and down accordingly. So any other questions on central garage?
My understanding while being on the assembly is that the central garage fund is actually highly functional throughout the years. And does it, in your estimation, does it continue to be highly functional and working as designed?
Yes, it does. And, we can go look at any vehicle, and as they come up for replacement, we analyze what the balance is for that given vehicle. For example, I think the boom truck was a good one. We had 375,000, we got that got us pretty close. It's not very often that we actually have to come forward and request a supplemental appropriation. If, for example, that vehicle had come in at 350,000, the 25 left over would have immediately gone into the sinking fund for the next purchase. So yes, it's very functional. It definitely takes time and management to maintain that functionality, but it's working well.
Great, thank you. I do appreciate the time. I don't know if you spend it or department heads spend it. I don't know who spends the time on that, but very much appreciate that, because this one could bite us in the butt real hard if we didn't keep on top of it. So I'm pleased to hear that it continues to work well.
And our final internal service fund is our building maintenance fund. This one is a little bit different than our other funds because it had seed money, which it has slowly been eating up over the years. Some of the Stevens money went into this decades ago. So you can see that the working capital has kind of slowly been decreasing. In FY21, we implemented a new allocation model similar to what we do with the IT fund in order to determine how to charge out the services for the fund. Before we tried to do it by coding people's time, by coding equipment going out, that kind of thing. But it's impossible to capture all the time, and there's administrative costs that cannot be captured. So the allocation model seems to be working well. We actually didn't anticipate stopping the reduction in working capital the first year, but based on projections and the fact that staff were kind of redirected to deal with the CARES Act, particularly the transitional employment. It does look like this first year of implementation from FY20 to FY21, it pretty much stopped the reduction in working capital. So that's great news. There is a pretty significant reduction from FY21 to FY22. However, we feel confident now that we have this model. What the fund is essentially doing is it's kind of advancing funds to do 2 projects, and the departments will pay that back over time. So we have a repayment schedule built in. So we have a plan to replenish this reduction in working capital that we're seeing.
What buildings does this not capture? I'm thinking specifically schools. Does this capture schools within it?
No, it doesn't, unless staff are they'll very occasionally deal with something, but for the most part, no.
And what about the state building? Is that?
Yes.
That is in this one?
Yes.
Okay. We've heard over the years the concern about where things are at with our school buildings and the age that some of them are at and the investment that's going to be necessary. We also know that within those properties, there's significant infrastructure there that isn't necessarily termed a building, but is essential to its function and service to the kids in the schools. I'm thinking of like the playgrounds at Baranoff and Keat, also the Keat the covered play structure, and there's some serious serious issues with that that we haven't really been keeping up with. But personally, I would like to see us try to account for the buildings within all of this, because we do own those buildings. But I think that's a significant shift in how we've looked at it, over the past, several decades. So I don't know if that's a possible, something possible that we could do in the future, I guess.
I've taken note of that one and I'll research it.
Yeah, John, I would agree there that replacement and maintenance of school buildings is long overdue for a solid look. If we don't start formulating a plan now, we're going to be significantly behind the game. So in all your free time in your office, if you could go ahead and tackle that one too, it'd be much appreciated.
So you can see in terms of revenue, we really didn't, we're not budgeting to fully stop the negative flow as we had discussed kind of as a team. We're slowly implementing the full cost to spread that out to the departments. So you can see there's a small incremental increase in revenue for FY 22, as well as increased expense as we go forward. Of note, this is when, the staff really try to budget for everything they would like to accomplish in a year. They often don't get to everything they want to do. And so the fund generally comes in well under its expense budget. And you can see there's various bits of capital funded through this fund, with a more significant one this year, which is replacing the finish on some of this building's cedar, as well as addressing the carpeting in City Hall.
Does this fund, does the revenue match depreciation? And if not, should it?
There is, this fund does actually holds virtually no assets. So, I would say that, if it were to cover all of the assets of the city, which would include the schools, there's no way the city could afford to pay that much. So this one is really just about preventative maintenance. And, at this point, we've talked about expanding it, to create more of a sinking fund for more significant items. At this point, it's smaller. It's making sure things are painted, making sure, the exterior of buildings are kept up, and carpets fixed, things like that.
But it does sound like that this is one where a master plan overhaul is either due or in process, in works. We're thinking about how this fund operates, how this fund works.
We are very much thinking about how this fund operates, and as we get more comfortable with the allocation model, we'll certainly be starting to consider making it a tool to help us ensure that some of our deferred maintenance has a funding source.
Okay, and then a little bit off topic there, but then would that model be scalable to maintenance needs in the rest of the municipality?
This one, this fund does cover a lot of the maintenance needs. I think an example is if there's a lift station that needs to be painted, this fund would deal with it. But it wouldn't necessarily be dealing with the equipment that's in that lift station. That would be the wastewater fund.
Okay, yeah, I'm just trying to, like harbors, if they have maintenance that needs to be done and you develop a model here, that this might be then transferable to harbors as well to make sure we're staying up on that maintenance. Just a thought. Okay, so it looks like we are at the end of our presentation. The assembly definitely has plenty of time now for any discussion on what has been presented. If there are any further questions that have come up about the enterprise funds and general service funds, now would be the time for us to talk about those.
I just had a general question. This is your second time of going through the budget like this, John, and I was wondering if there was anything in your process going through it that really popped for you, anything that, was either a concern or something that you would like to say is a highlight of sorts, I guess. I don't know how else to put it, but were there things that you really were either impressed by or concerned by?
That's a good question. The enterprise funds, something that really stood out to me is each one of those funds operates like a business, and we need to run it like a business. We need to try to, I know we're not a for-profit agency, but to be able to kind of keep things in the positive, we have infrastructure needs, we have maintenance needs, and instead of tying our rates in those enterprise funds to make a profit, we just need to get those rates appropriate to cover our needs and try to even out. So I learned a lot there. And the internal service funds, I like how it's used to cover the needs of many of the other departments. And I think that with more centralization of services that we're trying to push for, we're going to be able to see these funds used in a way that can help the other departments and then kind of relieve some of that burden of them trying to do it themselves. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that was a good question. I'd like to see his insights on the process. I know it's his budget, but I think as you learn in your process, you can definitely go forward, and anything that you can provide to us is going to help, the assembly go forward as well. So not seeing any other points of conversation come up right now. I want to throw something out there for consideration. I don't want to take any action on it tonight, but it's something I'm thinking about, something I'm stewing on, and John, it probably a little bit of a departure from what you guys have done right now. So don't panic. The assembly may not adopt said ideas, but right now we're currently in the process of or about to start multiple rate studies and master plans for a bunch of our enterprise funds to include electric, harbors, water, and wastewater. And I just wonder if we don't wait to set our rates until we see what those plans come back with. Because right now, while we are doing a very educated guess, it's just that it's an educated guess. A lot of these times it is an inflationary educated guess, which I believe is a solid footing to be on. But I think if we get those master plans back, if we get those rate studies back, there is the opportunity not only to potentially lower that needed increase, but it also gives us an added level of proving to our citizens that this is why we need to do this rate increase. So that's even further justification of, well, I don't like the rate increase. I don't either. Look at this master plan that we now have. So it's definitely a departure. It would definitely affect the outcomes of each of these funds because we would not be doing any rate increases until we see the results of these master plans. And it kind of throws a kink in everything. But I believe that there's some validity to it. I believe that there's some validity to having something solid to rest on. So I don't know what the rest of the assembly feels about that, if there is even a thought at the moment, but it's just something I've been stewing on as a potential way to go forward here. Tor?
Well, I guess I wouldn't want to make a decision tonight, of course, and we can't. I guess it's not on the agenda, but just off the top of my head, I think we have a very good idea of what we need for this year. I mean, it's near term. We know what the debt is for each one. We know what projects they need to do this year. And if we hold off, it's obviously going to hurt the balance of the funds. And I guess when I see the rate plans are looking 20 years out, where we don't necessarily know what the needs are going to be, where we do know what the needs are going to be for the next year. And I guess I also really strongly suspect that these rate analyses are not going to show a lower rate. In fact, I think just the opposite. Again, I'd like to think about it some more, but just off the top of my head, that's kind of what occurs to me.
Kevin, did you have something?
Go ahead, Josh.
Or Valerie?
I like your idea, Mr. Mayor, and I think the public would appreciate it too. And I'm not just going to assume that those rate studies say, you know, the citizens of Sitka are not paying enough when they're paying, you know, almost 200% more on their water and their, you know, garbage, sewer, whatever, than they did 10 years ago. So I like that idea. Thank you.
Well, I think it's a reasonable thing to consider into the future. Maybe I would agree with Tor. I don't think it's probably the best time to do it. Looking at just take the harbor fund, for example. I think best case scenario, we remain where we're at unless there's some really amazing thing that a plan comes forward with. We've been falling so short of what it's really costing to replace the infrastructure within the harbor system, that I think the plan that we have now that we're operating from right now is going to get revised in such a way that we're going to have to make some really big changes in order to even stay with 5%. I think, it'd be wonderful if we could, give a reprieve to our ratepayers, but we also need to continue to at least keep up with inflation. And we live in a capital market, and our inflation is just a matter of fact. It happens. It's happening to businesses. It's happening to our government services. So it's something that we have to acknowledge. And if we don't keep up with it, and we're going to see what we have seen over the last 10 years, because the 10 years previous to this, we didn't see rate increases. Water was flat for 10 years. And that's why we're seeing the spikes that we're seeing. Same with wastewater and our solid waste is, we're seeing what's happening there. And that's a for-profit contract that we don't have a lot of choices around. So it would be my desire to stick with this plan for right now. And I don't know what the timeline is on any of these master plans. That harbor master plan is, at best, we're going to see that in 9 months. So I think that's a long time to wait in this budget cycle.
I'm gonna just
Rebecca?
add to that I think we need to just stay where we are. My initial reaction to your suggestion is love it, but let's stay the course with what we're planning right now. And then as those rate studies come in, if we can adjust down anywhere, absolutely, let's do it. And if we have to adjust up, I guess we'd have to do that too. But can we pivot that quickly? Do we just set the rates once a year, or can we adjust rates throughout the year?
I think we could adjust rates down
Yeah.
throughout the year. I don't see why not. I think.
Yep.
Yeah, I think this just kind of sets us up for the year. So we could.
If I could add
Actually
something
did
to
last year.
Yeah.
Where we did the delay.
We did.
I'm a big fan of planning and studies and revisiting those studies every so often. I mean, I bring it back to the emergency management world. You know, you call it the planning P. Some have probably heard of it. Some others maybe haven't heard of it. But it's a diagram that's shaped like a P, and you talk about planning and are you meeting your goals? And then how often do you reevaluate that plan? And it's a continuous process. So I think with a good master plan and pairing that with a potential fiscal policy or some sort of finance committee to help us out, then it's easy to look at what we need to do 10, 20, 30 years out and kind of set some policies and use some study numbers to kind of stabilize that as much as we can for the public. So I'm a big supporter of that effort. In this year, however, you know, I'm obviously not giving my for or against it, but this year, some of these rate studies are budgeted using some of the rate increases that we're presenting.
Yeah, thanks everybody for that. I knew it was a further out there idea, but it was based in some solid thought, I think. So yeah, just food to think about. We still have a couple budget meetings if we want to continue to talk about that. So anything else on our 2022 enterprise funds and internal service funds? All right, thank you for the presentation. It is much appreciated. I think I got lots of information out of that. And I did appreciate all the color in the graphs.
Mr. Mayor,
Looks like they took lots of time.
I did want to thank Melissa. You know, this is my first time through this, and I feel like everything so far has been at a level that I can understand it. And then the aesthetic involved in each of these, including the little graphics, it's helpful. Thank you.
And not only at a level we can understand, but the ability to have input as well. I think you're both actively seeking that as this presentation goes through, as opposed to, all right, this is how it is. And at the end, we're just done. So I appreciate the openness and willingness to listen to what we have to say as well. So that'll bring us to item B then, if desired, which is a general wrap up of the 22 draft budget. And this involves anything within the 22 draft budget. Does anybody have anything tonight? As a general wrap up.
Do we have any new information about CARES or other funding that might come forward that is going to help the city?
Just one small change, and I can't remember if I announced this one or not, but I know the email was probably sent to you, just that summary from our lobbyist. He sent out a summary of what it looks like at the moment, but it looks like potentially 3.4 million could be coming now to the city and borough. There's two pots of money under that. Is it the Rescue America plan or America Rescue Plan? I can't remember what the name of it is. But we're a city and a borough, and there's a pot of money for the municipality and a pot of money for counties. And similar to Juneau, we qualify for both of those, but there's still some treasury review that has to happen. I think there's some rules around it where whatever money you receive can't exceed 25% of your annual operating expenses or operating budget. So the Treasury will need to look at that before the funding is issued. But right now, the estimates look like 3.4 million or so coming to the city and borough, and it can be used for revenue replacement. There are some hoops we'll have to jump through to to get there, and there's some ways that we're going to have to show that we lost revenues. And then there's another significant pot of money coming for, I wish I brought it all with me. I had the name of the program too for the infrastructure as well, but there's more to come there.
I think just to add to that, it's going to be very much like the CARES Fund, where the rules are going to be evolving. So it's too soon. There's definitely, we were on a webinar last week that, a few things made, kind of raised concerns about how easy it's going to be to spend. So it's going to be one of those things that we're going to have to really wait until we get more information to know what the possible uses are.
And from the school district standpoint, is it going to operate somewhat similar to how it did in the first iteration? Is it, it's going to flow, almost all of this money flows through the state, but is the school district going to get a direct payment, or is there going to be payments that'll come through the city because the majority of our funding for the district is assumed that it comes from our property tax assessment or levies. But really in the end, we all know it's just our general fund, and our general fund is down. So are there ways that we'll be able to use some of that to make our payment to the district?
Potentially, there's still a lot of questions out there. The general impression I get from sitting through some of these sessions is that it looks like there's going to be less of a burden on the municipalities to do what we did last time and have to develop our own programs and manage our own programs. It looks like a lot of these are higher level, and there might be something specifically for the schools, and funding will go directly to the schools. And then there's specifically funding for infrastructure. There's big bump ups in housing assistance. So again, it looks like those are being managed at a much higher level, and they're kind of taking that burden off the individual cities. But that's the best I have right now. I don't know any more specifics.
Okay, great, thanks.
I don't know if we've learned anything from the first round of CARES funding. It's that we should wait until the last day and not spend any money, where they then finally liberalize all the rules and give us way more time than we thought we had. So we'll just sit on it for a while until the rules become favorable. Anything else on item B? Generalized wrap up? Okay. Brings us to persons to be heard. This is any item on or off tonight's agenda, not to exceed 3 minutes.
Richard Ween. I'd like to quote the poet Robert Burns, which states that the best laid plans of mice and men oft gone agee, and meaning often go astray. And that relates to looking at all of these master plans and so forth, because you're looking way out into things. Just as a note, it's the Assembly's budget, though Mr. Leach constructs it with the help of city staff. Ultimately, it's the Assembly that approves it and should have enough information about what's going on to make the correct decision, because it's their budget. The thing about the Eliason Electric, well, I think that was an Assembly decision, and these types of decisions, have to do with due diligence and understanding what we're getting involved in, and we can see that that is something that is real. Of interest, as far as planning, there's a journal called Alaska Trends, and if you look at it, I read it every month, it's nice, but this month concerns migration. And we're not talking caribou, we're talking migration of people in and out of the state. And basically it's a net negative. And I'm not going to give you the stats here. I invite you as homework to look it up, to see what's happening to Southeast and to understand what the future is, and then see what has been going on for the last decade. Of interest, we heard about a 1.5 DEC low-cost loans. Well, just to let you know, the other day, because it's now on a variable rate, the 10-year treasuries were 1.75. So these types of costs are going up. By the way, inflation is built into the system. That's what the Fed wants. They want at least it's pegged at 2, and it depends on what's going on as far as the consumer price index, whether that adds on it or not. Whether you realize it or not, at the beginning, if we used to have a date, gasoline was $2.06 nationally at the time of the election, and it's now $2.80, and it's believed that it's going to continue to rise. Of interest, oil prices, though initially we're close to 70 as far as Brent crude, is now plummeted down to 63. Another homework assignment is to find out why. How does that affect the state? Well, each dollar change is about $25 to $35 million for the state. Lots of things going on, but I see that my time is running out. So I thank you very much. The budget process is very difficult, and looking into the future is very difficult. And I'm afraid it's going to be a difficult future. And you cannot depend on the Fed or the state to give you money. It has to be from within. Thank you.
Any other persons to be heard for items on or off tonight's agenda? All right, seeing none, that'll bring us to adjournment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. We are adjourned.